Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill, so the sisters sent a message to Jesus.
Lord, he whom you love is ill.
But when Jesus heard it, he said,
This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.
Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples,
Let us go to Judea again.
The disciples said to him,
Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and you were going there again?
Jesus answered,
Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them.
After saying this, he told them,
Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him.
The disciples said to him,
Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right.
Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly,
Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.
Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples,
Let us also go, that we may die with him.
When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus,
Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him.
Jesus said to her,
Your brother will rise again.
Martha said to him,
I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day.
Jesus said to her,
I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?
She said to him,
Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world.
When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately.
The teacher is here and is calling for you.
And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him,
Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said,
Where have you laid him?
They said to him,
Lord, come and see.
Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said,
See how he loved him.
but some of them said,
Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?
Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said,
Take away the stone.
Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him,
Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days.
Jesus said to her,
Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?
So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said,
Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me.
When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice,
Lazarus, come out.
The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them,
Unbind him and let him go.
Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. The Gospel of the Lord. 4 days. 4. When Jesus arrived, Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Seems like an insignificant detail, but it's not. In the culture in which Jesus was living, there was a prevailing belief that when somebody died, their spirit would hover near the body for 3 days. Now, there's nothing in the Old Testament that suggests this, but the whole idea, that sort of there's a spirit in a body is more of a Greek idea, but that's what people thought. People thought that when you died, your spirit hovered near your body for 3 days, and then you were gone. That was it. It's kind of like today when people picture folks who have died sitting on clouds and playing harps. You've seen all these cartoons and stuff like that. There's nothing in the New Testament that suggests that's what happens when you die, but it's the popular belief. It's what people think. And the popular concept among everybody who came to console Martha and Mary was that Lazarus' spirit might hover near his body for 3 days, but then he was gone. By day 4, it was over. There was really no hope. So when Jesus arrives, Lazarus has already been in the tomb 4 days. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying, some of the bystanders say? But Jesus had not kept him from dying. He was dead, and it was now 4 days later. There was no hope. When Martha arrives, grieving for her brother and probably a little ticked off at Jesus for not showing up sooner, she sort of states the obvious expectation, and she said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Yet she goes on, but even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Still, it's a mistake to think that Martha anticipates Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. She has no idea what he's going to do and does not clearly expect that that's even possible. Your brother will rise again, says Jesus, to which Martha replies, yeah, I know. Lazarus will rise again on the last day. Martha, like many Jews in her day, saw the promise of the resurrection in the Old Testament, and she believed them. She believed those promises for her brother. She believed them for herself. But that was probably a long way off. She didn't really think that there was any hope left for now. Hope was gone, notwithstanding Jesus' arrival. It had been 4 days. She reiterates this when Jesus says, take the stone away. Lord, she says, he stinks. That's literally what it says in the Greek. He stinks because he has been dead 4 days. Did you forget that, Jesus? 4 days. What are you going to do after 4 days? Yet Martha somehow trusts Jesus to do something even though she didn't know what. She has the stone moved away, and Jesus calls Lazarus, who walks out of the tomb after 4 days. The raising of Lazarus is the final sign in John's gospel, and it's the only time in John's gospel that Jesus raises anybody from the dead. Jesus raises people from the dead in other gospels too, but it's never after 4 days, and also the stories aren't nearly as long. John records this story not only because Jesus raised somebody from the dead, but because he raised somebody from the dead after 4 days. And in doing so, Jesus didn't just revive a dead person. He revived hope for everybody standing there. Everybody who gathered to mourn Lazarus probably felt that after a certain amount of time, 4 days in this case, their hope was gone. Nobody could help them, probably not even God. It was over. And after you lose somebody close to you, you feel like, or you can feel like often, it's over for you too. You lose any sense of hope that there's a way forward and that there's really anything even God can do to revive you. And it's in this context that Jesus not only revives Lazarus, but he revives the hope of everybody else. Everybody who might feel that hope was gone for them. And this doesn't mean that people now felt that every time somebody died, Jesus would come along and fix it. The raising of Lazarus is the one and only time that Jesus brought anybody back from the dead. It also doesn't mean that Jesus will fix things so that everybody lives happily ever after. we stop reading this story after 45 verses because it's long. And it sounds like, oh, and now he's raised from the dead and everybody lives happily ever after. But, spoiler alert, if you keep reading for another 20 verses or so, you find out that because people start believing in Jesus, because he raised Lazarus from the dead, the folks plotting to kill Jesus also begin plotting to kill Lazarus as well. So now this poor guy who has just been raised from the dead is ironically the subject of a hit. He's got to live with a death threat. Everything is not just rosy. But when Jesus arrives, hope is what he revives for people. Hope even after 4 days. And that hope doesn't mean that everything will be fine or that Jesus will fix all of our problems. But it does mean that God has not abandoned us or forgotten about us even after 4 days, or whatever time period I decide is so long that God must surely not be listening or caring. I mean, one of the biggest takeaways from this story is never to think that God doesn't hear or care just because it feels like it's been too long that we've been waiting for an answer. Don't know how this is in your life, but I know sometimes in mine, I keep saying to God, kind of like Martha and Mary, yo, God, got a problem here. Help me with this problem. And I don't seem to get an answer. I don't feel like God has shown up. And it's tempting to think, you know what? God is just going to ignore me on this one. I'm not going to get help on this one. Maybe God's not listening. Maybe God doesn't care. Maybe God has just said, no, you're going to have to deal with this yourself. And I am tempted to believe after a while that it's been 4 days, whatever that time period is. What is 4 days for you? How long does it take for you to start saying, maybe I should just give up on God? One of the things Jesus does in this story is to remind people that God never gives up on us. Jesus did not give up on Lazarus, Mary, or Martha, even when it felt like it. And that's one of the key takeaways from this story. When Jesus revives hope, he means to show us that Jesus is going to give us strength and courage to continue to move stones that have kept us back even after 4 days. You know, sometimes after those 4 days, whatever the 4 days are like for me or for you, I just don't feel like moving the stones anymore. I figure, here it is, I've pushed the stone in front of whatever was. I don't know that it's going to get better, and I'm really not interested and don't have the energy anymore to move that stone away and see if God has something different behind that stone. Yet sometimes just the willingness to try to get up and move that stone a little bit is a sign that Jesus is near me, that Jesus is working in our lives to say, give it a shot, see what's there, even though, like Martha, you don't know what God's going to do. But sometimes it's the moving of the stone that shows us that way forward. And Jesus revives hope in this story by promising that Jesus is giving us a future. Even when, like Mary and Martha, it's difficult to see that future because of the tears and the trauma of the moment. You know, often I get caught up in wanting the future that I can imagine. The future the way I think it should be, the future the way I wanted it to be, the future that might have been, and I get so caught up in that I'm not open to seeing the future that actually will be, that actually is possible in front of me. Neither Martha nor Mary, nor for that matter Lazarus, envisioned what Jesus was going to do. And because of that, what Jesus did, because of the way he did things, their future was actually still very different than what they might have envisioned it to be only a week ago. They probably thought Jesus is going to show up, Jesus is going to take Lazarus by the hand, Lazarus is going to be okay, we're going to continue on the way we thought life was going to be. And now life would continue on, but life was going to be different. Life was going to be changed. I mean, not only did Lazarus have a hit out on him, but they have celebrity status now, but they also know that Jesus is leading them forward into a new kind of life. Jesus is going to be with them, even when they think he isn't there. And Jesus is going to be helping them. That kind of future is exciting. That kind of future has hope. And that's the kind of future that Jesus promises to us also, even when the future we're living into doesn't look like the future we had imagined maybe even last week. Jesus revived hope, even after 4 days. And the hope Jesus revived is not simply hope for life after death. Instead, Jesus revived hope by showing the power of God right here and right now, even after 4 days. Jesus shows that God's power to act is never limited by 4 days or any other time period we set up. Jesus shows that no stone that we put at the end of our hope is heavy enough to prevent God from giving us new life. And Jesus shows us that even when it's different from what we imagined, there is a future for all of us, not only in heaven, but right now, and beyond whatever 4 days we may have been living through.